It's my great pleasure again to welcome you all here this evening for the wonderful program that is about to come. Without further ado, I present to you Dean Michael Nacht of the Goldman School of Public Policy here at Berkeley, and our very special guest, Ambassador Joseph Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us get our guitars tuned.
Ambassador Wilson, welcome to UC Berkeley, welcome to the International House, welcome to the Goldman School, and welcome back to California.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being here. I had a chance to say hello to some of you out in the audience. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to say hello to all of you, but they had to mic me up. But it's true, I'm actually from California, and as I've said earlier, I would have probably been a graduate, an alumnus of UC Berkeley, as my parents were alumni of UC Berkeley, except that Berkeley and the campus of UC Berkeley is not in Santa Barbara. And so as a consequence, I'm an alumnus of UC Santa Barbara, and particularly Campus Point, the best waves on that particular part of the coast.
Ambassador Wilson traces his family roots back to at least the 19th century in California, maybe even earlier. And one of his great uncles was the longest-serving mayor of San Francisco and governor of California, and also a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1920 and 1932. And he comes from a long line of activist Republican political figures.
And they still love me. Most of them do. Most of them do.
So I hope that in the next hour or so, we can cover a lot of ground. I'd like to begin at one of the most recent times, which is the press conference of the Special Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald on October 28th, which was just about 10 days ago. And in the course of his remarks, he said the following: "I think what we see here today, when a vice president's chief of staff is charged with perjury and obstruction of justice, is to show the world that this is a country that takes its laws seriously, that all citizens are bound by the law. But what we need to also show the world is we can also apply the same safeguards to all our citizens, including high officials. Much as they must be bound by the law, they must follow the same rules." Is what has been happening here in these events at which you and your wife have been at the center, is this about the rule of law?
Well, first of all, let me suggest to you that the only reason that Valerie and I have been at the center of this is because the White House and its allies have put us at the center of this. In reality, the day after my opinion piece appeared in the New York Times, and it appeared on July 6th of 2003, which is George Bush's birthday, by the way. Coincidentally, it wasn't timed that way. But the day after the article appeared, it was entitled "What I Did Not Find in Africa." It was 1,500 words relaying the story of my trip out there. It did not relate the story or the conclusions of two other investigations into the same allegation, because I was not in a position to talk about these other people's trips, so I talked only about my trip. The day after that article appeared, the White House called the Washington Post and the New York Times and said the 16 words did not rise to the level of inclusion in the State of the Union address, essentially acknowledging the argument that I had made in my column the previous day, that in fact there was nothing to sustain those 16 words. At that point, then the argument or the debate or any follow-up on that particular issue should have been conducted on that issue. Congress or the journalists or everybody else should have gone back and said, well, why were these 16 words in the State of the Union address? Who put them in? What was the motive of putting them in? Was it to manipulate intelligence? But it should have been back on the White House to answer those questions. Instead, the White House and their allies, the Republican National Committee, Ed Gillespie and Ken Mellman, all the sort of pre-Swift boaters who were operating before the Swift boat crowd got into operation, decided that they would try and deflect attention from the White House and put it on Wilson and his wife. So it's important to understand that. The only reason that we're involved in this is because of a concerted campaign on the part of the most senior officials of our government. Scooter Libby was an assistant to the President of the United States. Karl Rove is an assistant to the President of the United States. A concerted effort on their part to divert attention from the unassailable fact that the 16 words had never been the State of the Union address. Now, with respect to the indictment, I see the indictment of Mr. Libby and the ongoing investigation from 2 points of view. One, I think it's a sad day when indictments are handed up to the very door of the White House of this great democracy of ours, particularly on charges of obstruction of justice and perjury. Senior officials of the federal government swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And for them to be accused, or for a senior official to be accused of impeding an investigation, a legitimate Justice Department investigation, into whether or not a crime has been committed, it is indeed a sad day for the country that a public official is accused of so abusing the public trust. On the other hand, however, and this is what I think Mr. Fitzgerald was getting at, we should all celebrate the reaffirmation that in our country, what is really sacred, what is paramount, is the rule of law. That forms the basis of our social contract between the governed and those who govern us. And it's important from time to time that that be reaffirmed. And in this case, it has been reaffirmed. And Mr. Fitzgerald has made it clear that this is a nation of laws and no man is above the law. The other thing that he did stress, and which I always like to stress as well, is that you are innocent until proven guilty in our system of justice. And so I don't presume Mr. Libby is necessarily guilty of these crimes, although I certainly am glad to see that he's out of the White House.
In the ensuing 10 days since the indictment, in the public debate about the indictment and its significance, I would say there are both maximalists and minimalists, my own term. Maximalists say this is the tip of an iceberg, this is equivalent to the cheap third-rate burglary of Watergate, and it's going to lead right to the presidency, right to the president, and perhaps even trigger some sort of impeachment crisis and a crisis of government. Those would be what I call the maximalists. But the minimalists have a very different perspective, and they say, look, Mr. Libby was the only individual indicted, very senior person, first time in 100 years an assistant to the president has been indicted, but only one person was indicted. He was indicted for 2 counts of perjury, 1 count of obstruction of justice, 2 counts of false statements. He's innocent until proven guilty, and notably, the indictment does not charge Libby with the original alleged offense that the grand jury set out to investigate, which was illegally revealing the identity of a covert agent in violation of a 1982 federal law. So the minimalist would say, it's a serious matter, the courts will decide, but don't make a bigger deal of it than it is, irrespective of your political wishes. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that?
Well, when I was a diplomat many years ago, I too probably would have used euphemisms like maximalist and minimalist to describe the two sides. Now that I'm no longer a diplomat, I will speak frankly and say what you're really saying are Democrats and Republicans, with the Democrats being the maximalists and the Republicans being the minimalists. It ought to be of great consternation to Republicans as well as Americans in general that not a single Republican of national stature has bothered to stand up and say what Scooter Libby did or what Karl Rove did was wrong. Not that it was treasonous, not that it was illegal, but just that it was wrong. We now have some facts before us. Those facts include that Mr. Libby was the source of the information of my wife's identity, which was covered in the first statement of Mr. Fitzgerald's press conference. He said she was a covered employee. Her status and the protection of that status was covered by American law. We have facts on the ground. We have evidence that has been placed before the grand jury and before the American people that Mr. Libby divulged her identity to Judy Miller, that he was a secondary source to Mr. Novak. We also have the fact that Mr. Rove divulged her identity to Matt Cooper, the reporter from Time magazine, from Matt's own testimony and from contemporaneous emails between him and his boss. Now that is a violation of national security. And we also have indictments, and the indictment makes it very clear that one of the reasons why Mr. Fitzgerald could not make a judgment on whether or not to indict on the organic crime of violating the national security of the country was because Mr. Libby was actively engaged, he alleges, in an attempt to impede that investigation and obstruct justice. So I can't tell you whether or not the Democrats or the maximalists are right, and that this will, in fact, make Watergate look like the third-rate burglary it was, by comparison. But what I can tell you is that if the Republicans want to be the party that coddles lawbreakers and coddles people who violate the national security of the country, well, they have to answer to the public for that. I don't think it's a position that I would want to be in if I were a Republican.
Okay. Let's go back in time. Perhaps we'll come back to that, but we'll come back to it later. Let's go back in time and fill in some of the historical aspects of this, because many of us have been closely attentive to it, but some others have not. So you joined the Foreign Service in 1976, and you were in the Foreign Service for 22 years. And in that time, you became an Africanist. Your first diplomatic posting was to Niger, and you were ambassador to 2 countries, and you were also the acting ambassador to Iraq at the time of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. You retired in 1998. How did you ultimately, it's discussed in your book, but some of us haven't all read it, how did you become involved so that you would be asked by the Central Intelligence Agency
Sure.
to look into the validity of this assertion about Niger's uranium activities with Iraq?
Sure. Well, in addition to having been in the unique position of having served both in Niger and in Iraq, and having known the presidents of Niger and Saddam Hussein, in fact, the first line of my obituary used to be the last American diplomat to have met with Saddam Hussein before the first Gulf War. It's now, of course, the husband of the first American spy ever to have her identity compromised by her own government. I'm hopeful that I will live long enough for a third first line of the obituary to be penciled in. But during the 90s, one of my jobs, I had 2 jobs after being ambassador to Gabon and to Sao Tome and Principe. One was to be political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Armed Forces Europe. And that particular military command had responsibility for most of Africa. And in that job, we put together a program called the African Crisis Response Initiative, which allowed us to train African troops at the multi-battalion level in order to be prepared to respond to African disasters, either genocides or natural disasters. That took us to Niger on a number of occasions, and I was able to renew my many friendships with the Niger government, friendships that I had developed at first in my tour there from 1976 to 1978. After I came back to Washington to serve as Special Assistant to the President of the United States for African Affairs at the National Security Council. And in that capacity, I worked very closely with the Niger government as it went through 2 military coups, one which overturned a democratically elected government, and the second one which resulted in the assassination of the first military coup leader. And at that time, both in the White House and then afterwards, when I was in the private sector, I was involved in helping the Niger authorities move the soldiers back into the barracks. I made a number of trips out to Niamey, both at the request of the generals and at the request of the civilians who ran the administration, to try and help them transition out of government and back to the barracks. Indeed, after the one president, who was a very good friend of mine, was assassinated, I went out to meet with his successor. Before his successor had even moved into the presidential palace, we met in his barracks. He was surrounded by AK-47 toting bodyguards, the same bodyguards who had assassinated his predecessor. And I sat there with him and told him in no uncertain terms. And I can be very frank, as some of you who may have seen me on various programs, The Daily Show or some of the other programs, I can be pretty candid. And I told him in no uncertain terms what he needed to do if he ever hoped to restore any semblance of dignity to his own name and to the name of the organization that he had grown up in, which was the Presidential Bodyguard. And I basically laid out an agenda of 18 months of transitioning back to democratic rule. I did this at the request of the civilian authorities of the government, who asked me to come out and have a little heart-to-heart talk with him. And at the end of my talk with him, I said to him that based on my long experience in Africa, my advice to him was that after he transitioned back to a democratically elected government, he should plan on leaving the country for a while because, frankly, his successor was not going to be very comfortable having him watching his back, since it had been his organization that had shot his predecessor in the back. He invited me back out to Niamey 18 months later, and in those intervening 18 months, the Niger government had, in fact, transitioned. They had had an election, and they were just on the eve of the inauguration of the new civilian-elected president of the country. And I went out to...
This was when?
This was in 99 or 2000. I went back out there at the request of the military coup leader, and he received me out at the airport. You need to understand, in Africa, you're told to come out there, but appointments aren't set until you're actually on the ground, and you have to kind of fit into the president's schedule, understandably. So I met him out at the airport, and I was out there with all the other dips and diplomats and government officials, because in Africa, you always go out to the airport to say goodbye to the president and then say hello to him when he comes back, wherever he may be traveling. And he called me, his chief assistant called me from the herd there, took me into the presidential office, and I sat with him, and he said to me, he said, "You remember our conversation of 18 months ago?" I said, "You bet I do." He said, "Well, I've done everything that you suggested I do," and I said, "You sure have, and that's a good thing." And he said, "I wanted you particularly to come back here, and I particularly wanted to meet you here at the airport, because, as you know, I'm on my way to make an official visit to Nigeria, the neighboring country. But while I'm there, I'm going to be picking up the keys to my new house, because I will be leaving the country, and I will be living there until the new democracy allows itself to be seated." Now, you can imagine what sort of credibility that gave me with the civilian authorities with whom I had been working for the better part of the 1990s. Now, in addition to that, of course, I spoke French, something Bob Novak doesn't do. I had served as ambassador to another country that was a uranium producer, and I had also traveled to Niger at the request of the CIA in the late 90s on other uranium-related matters that had nothing to do with Iraq, but had to do with weapons of mass destruction. So those are my bona fides. That is how the CIA knew about me. In the U.S. government, I was one of two people who knew that particular Niger government very well. The other one had been our ambassador on the ground when I had been doing all this work, and he was not as favorably regarded by the Nigerians, not because he wasn't a good officer, he was, but because he was in a position where he always had to deliver the bad news that I asked him to deliver from my position at the White House. Good cop, bad cop.
From your own experience, would it be unusual for the CIA, given that it's the run-up to the war in Iraq, to basically request someone who's not one of their own to go on such a sensitive mission as opposed to one of their own agents?
No, the CIA collects information in any number of different ways, and without going into all the details, their job is to get the best information they can using the best assets they can find. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the CIA presence in a lot of these countries that are not of strategic importance to the United States is minimal or non-existent. So they go around and look for people who actually can get the job done. Again, there was nobody who knew the government of Niger better than I did, and who had really very deep and close relationships with them, relationships built over years of having worked together on something as fundamental as how they were going to structure their government in the face of two military coups and the assassination of a president. These are legitimate, strong bona fides. And the trip itself came about really as a consequence of a meeting that was held out at the CIA to discuss this report that had come and landed on the Vice President's desk, which asserted that Iraq had attempted to purchase about 500 tons. It was a memorandum of sale, it was purported to be, of 500 tons of uranium from Niger to Iraq.
Was this through British sources?
I can't tell you. I was not briefed on the nature of the source. It has since been reported widely that it was actually came out of Italy, but I can't tell you from the specific briefings that I received. But what I can tell you is I was briefed that the Vice President had raised a question about this report, and the CIA was tasked really with answering the question. And it was a very serious question because, after all, there would be only one reason for Saddam Hussein to want to buy uranium yellowcake from anywhere, and that would be to resuscitate his nuclear weapons program. The National Security Council was created in 1947 specifically to give the President of the United States an office that looked at strategic threats to our society, or as Brent Scowcroft used to say, to count nukes in the hands of our enemies. So it was a serious question raised by a serious official. The CIA tried to give it a serious answer. They convened a meeting of everybody who knew anything about the subject in their analytical community, and they invited me to participate because I happen to have a lot of on-the-ground experience in Niger, including this trip, as I mentioned, I had made earlier, and I knew a lot about the uranium business. It was as an outgrowth of that meeting, when we went around the table and everybody shared information on what they knew. It was at the end of that the person who was chairing the meeting asked me if I would be prepared to go out and try and answer some of the outstanding questions. I said, sure, if need be, but what are the outstanding questions? Let's game out how we would approach this. The second half of the meeting was really figuring out what we didn't know, trying to figure out what questions need to be answered, and what my value added would be to trying to get answers to those questions.
You're not at liberty to reveal who the person was who directed you to do this?
I have no idea what his name was, but I can tell you he was male. I can tell you I'm not married to a male. I can tell you my wife was not at the meeting, because that's what, of course, you're getting at,
right,
was whether or not my wife had anything to do with it. My wife served as a conduit. She was the one who relayed to me the request that I attend the meeting. She, not surprisingly, when she was asked by her supervisor to provide a thumbnail sketch of my bona fides, she knows me better than anybody out there. She was able to do it in about 30 seconds. It's basically 3 lines, 4 lines. And when I went out to the CIA headquarters, not surprisingly, she escorted me into the building. She took me to the meeting room. I made the introductions. She left. She was not at the meeting. She did not participate in the decision to send me. She was not the one. The first time anybody ever asked me if I'd be prepared to go was at that meeting, and she was not present. By the way, the meeting was, the trip out to Niger was pro bono. And the trip was not, in fact, a CIA mission. And I made it very clear in the meeting when they said, would you be willing to undertake this? I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it, but you need to understand I don't do clandestine. I'm not a spy. And even if I may be anonymous here in Washington, which I was then, not anymore, but I was then, I was not an anonymous personality in Niger because of this half-year work with these guys at the highest level of the Niger government. Indeed, when I landed in Niamey, by the time I got from the airport to my hotel, 3 people were at the hotel waiting for me, even though nobody in Niamey knew I was coming when I got there. So I said this would have to be, I'd do this on behalf of my government. I will have to clear it through the ambassador on the ground there because I'm a former senior U.S. government official, the polite thing to do. And I would have to clear it through the Department of State, which I did.
Now, your trip took place in February 2002, 5 months after the 9/11 attacks here, but over a year before the actual U.S. invasion of Iraq. And you cite in your book and in your op-ed in the New York Times that you did not file a written report, although you say there should be at least 4 documents in the United States government archives confirming my mission. Is that unusual not to file a written report?
No, actually, if anybody who knows anything about journalism, it's basically the same sort of structure. You interview people, they interviewed me, I gave them my information. Somebody told me the other day that probably about 90%, 97% of the reports that end up being given to the CIA are oral reports. They have in their structure, in their management structure, they have what they call reports officers. And reports officers are the ones who essentially debrief sources and turn the sources debriefing into an intel report, using their language, their nomenclature, their definitional terms, things that they're familiar with. It is not unusual at all. And by the way, in addition to being 5 months after 9/11, it was also 8 months before I ever had formulated my own views on what U.S. policy towards Iraq should be. And so there are those who argue, as Bob Novak has tried to argue, that he was curious as to why they would send some Democratic partisan hack to Niger to do this. In February of 2002, I was mostly known as having been a hawk in the first Bush administration and as President Bush's charge in Baghdad during the first Gulf War, and as having been lauded by the first President Bush as a true American hero as he introduced me to his war cabinet. So, and I had not personally formulated any views on what U.S. policy towards Iraq should be. And when I did formulate those views towards the end of the summer, middle of the summer, and first wrote about it, which I think was October 13th, was my first article in the San Jose Mercury News, my position really was that if you're going to do something with Iraq, let's make sure we do something that's consistent with our own national security interests. And I believe then, I believe now, that disarmament and containment of Saddam was a legitimate national security objective, and that we ought to leverage our international leadership to resuscitate the international will to go back at Saddam for what I believe were probably still stockpiles of chemical weapons, biological precursors, and yes, indeed, an interest in a nuclear weapons program.
Now, you go to Niger, not for a very long period. You meet with key people. You know the policy process there. You know who has to sign off on which documents. But how confident are you that based on that mission, that there was nothing to the report? And why would you be so confident if you are?
Well, first of all, it's very helpful in the intelligence business to look at all information that comes over the transom with a healthy amount of skepticism, because people are trying to bamboozle the intelligence community every day for whatever reason, money, support for their agenda, whatever. And that's one of the reasons why you have a huge analytical component of the intelligence community. It is to sit there and try and sift through bits of information to determine what is fact and what is fiction. So healthy skepticism is very useful in that particular business. I went out there, I spent 8 days out there. It didn't take 8 days because I knew everybody. But to get to Niger from Europe, or indeed from North Africa, because I flew in actually through Casablanca, the two flights coming from the north, there are only 2 flights a week, and they arrive within 12 hours of each other. Mm-hmm. So you can really do it. You have 12 hours to accomplish your mission, which was too little because it was 12 hours during the night, or you have 8 days. And so I took the 8 days. But I looked at it from 2 different perspectives. One, I looked at the structure of the mining industry there, something I had a lot of familiarity with. And people should remember that uranium yellowcake is not weapons of mass destruction. So when my critics, who are legion in the right wing, when they say Wilson wasn't a WMD expert, uranium yellowcake is not WMD. It is just the first process of separating the ore from the rock. Anybody who has done any gold mining in California would understand that. If your gold mining you've done has been, even if you've been sort of running the pan in the river, you're still separating the gold from the rock there. That's what the yellowcake is. It is the ore separated from the rock. It is not weapons of mass destruction until it's enriched. But I looked at the mining industry. The mining industry in Niger is made up of 2 mines, and there are 5 consortium partners. 4 consortium partners in one mine and 5 consortium partners in the other. The managing partner of both mines is a French mining company. That means by managing partner, they're the ones who actually have their hands on the product from the time the product is in the ground till the time the product gets to the ultimate customer. Uranium in Niger the cost of producing uranium in Niger has been above the world market price almost since the mines came on stream in the early 70s. They operated at some profit margin for a couple of years, and then there were a couple of Canadian mines that came on stream, and then there was a slowdown in the demand for the product because of the slowdown in the nuclear energy business, and the price for uranium on the international market dropped below the cost of production of uranium in Niger. As a consequence of that, the annual production of the Niger mines has been steady at between 1,800 and 2,200 or 2,300 tons per year, just enough to satisfy the vertical integration requirements of the respective consortium partners for their own nuclear energy industries. So the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Japanese, and I believe the Austrians, or the French, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Spanish are I think the countries that were members of the consortium. They took product for their own nuclear energy industries, but there was no market for Niger uranium on the open market, and therefore there was there was no change in the production levels. The 500 tons that we were talking about, which was the sum that people thought were contained in this memorandum of agreement, would have represented a 40% increase in the annual production rate. Every year, the consortium partners meet in September, and they determine what the annual production rate is going to be, 1,800, 1,900, 2,000 tons, whatever their requirements are for that particular year. And every couple of months after that, they adjust the requirements based on what their view of their demand and their projected demand is going to be for the product. A 40% increase would have been an enormous increase in annual production rates. And anybody who knows anything about business would know how that would flow through the particular business. They would have needed more employees, they would have needed more trucks, they would have needed more barrels, they would have needed greater security, they would have needed more bills of lading to transport the stuff from the port. And these mines, we're talking about 500 tons here. We're not talking about pocketfuls of blood diamonds. We're talking about 500 tons sitting in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Would have to be dug out of the ground, separated from the rock, put into barrels, put into trucks, trucked across the Sahara Desert with military security to the port in Benin, Porto Novo, Benin, and then shipped to its ultimate destination without anybody knowing. That was the mining part of it. And if you really wanted to know about it, you just have to go back and see what their mining production figures were and whether or not there were any spikes in it, and talk to the French about it, because the French would know about this because they ran the mine. The second area that I looked at was the structure of the government decision-making process. Niger's participation in the mine was through a government-owned parastatal organization. And as a consequence, any decision on the part of the Nigerians to take a portion of the uranium for their own account, for their own sales overseas, would have required, at a minimum, the Minister of Mines agreeing to it. And because the allegation was that it was a memorandum it was an agreement between two sovereign nations, it would have required the approval of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who would have reviewed Niger's legal requirements under international law, particularly as it related to the sanctions on Iraq. And because it was a government-to-government transaction, it would have had to have been discussed at the Council of Ministers, a cabinet meeting, and the cabinet would have had to have come to a decision to approve this particular sale. That means that any document related to the sale would have had to have had a minimum 3 signatures. Signature of the Minister of Mines, signature of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the signature of the Prime Minister, and quite possibly the signature of the President, although I can't recall at this point. That document, any decision that was made, would have been gazetted, much like we put government decisions in the Federal Register. They, too, have a gazetting process to publish government decisions. It would have had revenue implications in a country that has been bankrupt since independence, and you would have had people scurrying about trying to get their hands on whatever revenue would have been generated by this sale. It would have been very, very difficult to keep secret, even if they'd wanted to keep secret. In any event, if the documents did not contain those 3 signatures, those documents could not be authentic under their own structure of making decision-making. I also looked at the possibility that the military coup leader, Colonel Barre, the person who was assassinated, or Colonel Wanke, the person who assassinated him, both of whom ended up being friends of mine. These hands have shaken the hands with a lot of bloody hands. But with the possibility that they might have actually done an off-the-books transaction. And it's not impossible that a military junta leader could engage in some sort of secret dealing. But we're talking about 500 tons, we're talking about the need to ramp up production secretly, and we're talking about the fact that the French mining company would have had to be involved in it. So I did report back that, in fact, if you needed to look into this further, which I didn't think you needed to because all the facts were pretty clear that you couldn't do this, but if the agency still wanted to look into it further, the next place to look would be at the French uranium mining company. As it turns out, I happen to have a few friends in French intelligence, and they made it very clear to me afterwards that they did look into it, and they found nothing to this either.
So based on all of that, your familiarity with the mining situation in Niger and with the governmental decision-making processes and with the French connections, you were quite confident that there was nothing to these assertions, and you conveyed that to the folks in the Central Intelligence Agency who asked you to go on that mission.
I conveyed it to the ambassador on the ground, who told me that my own conclusions squared with her conclusions because she, too, at the request of the State Department, had looked into this. She also conveyed to me that a 4-star Marine Corps general had also come down and done his own independent investigation at the request of the Defense Department and had come to the same conclusions as well. So there were 3 reports there, but I conveyed these conclusions to her. I conveyed those conclusions to a member of the embassy staff in great detail, much along the lines as I just conveyed them to you. I came back to Washington, and within 2 hours of my arriving back in Washington, somebody, the CIA reports officer, the guy who was paid to turn my raw data into a report, I conveyed it to him over a Chinese takeout dinner. And a couple of days later, I conveyed it to senior officials of the Bureau of African Affairs. The Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, State Department. The Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs later told me, an old friend of mine, that he had not, the Bureau of African Affairs had not been afforded the opportunity to review the State of the Union address. And as he said to me, you don't really think that we would have allowed that statement to have been in the State of the Union address if we'd had the opportunity to review it, do you?
Okay. By October of 2002, 7 months after you came back from Niger, you started to write occasional op-ed pieces quite critical of the Bush administration's handling of the Iraqi situation. This is prior to the war. And then, of course, it culminates in your July 6th New York Times op-ed, what I didn't find in Africa. And you state there in the second paragraph, based on my experience with the administration in the months leading up to the war, I have little choice but to conclude that some of the intelligence related to Iraq's nuclear weapons program was twisted to exaggerate the Iraqi threat.
A fine turn of phrase, I might add.
Now, of course, that's a very serious charge by a former senior diplomat who's taken this clandestine mission.
Not clandestine.
Well,
it was not clandestine. It was undertaking a mission on behalf of my government.
fair enough. Let's say it wasn't widely advertised.
Discreet.
Discreet.
The term I would use.
And married to someone who's in the covert service of the Central Intelligence Agency. In actually reflecting when you wrote that, I don't know if it was on a PC or quill pen or how you did it, did you ever think that this could lead to all kinds of trouble for me and my wife?
Well, let me go back to the first comment in this in your sort of question. My first article in the San Jose Mercury News was not, in fact, an anti-Bush article, because, of course, the debate was had just been undertaken. The administration, or factions within the administration, had certain views. The president had been talking about regime change, but I don't think that that time, certainly, they weren't telegraphing that they'd made any final decision. My article there was much along the lines of what Brent Scowcroft had written, what Jim Baker had written, what Dick Holbrooke had written, although both Baker and Holbrooke's op-eds were a little bit disingenuous. They both argued that, yes, we should go to war with Saddam, but we should go through the United Nations to do so. That was really a non-starter because you could not get a regime change war approved by the United Nations. It violates the UN Charter and particularly the phrase in it about the non-interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. The argument that Brent took, the line that Brent took was that this would result in a lot of chaos in the Middle East. And the line that I took was, as I said earlier, that disarmament was a legitimate national security concern with Saddam Hussein, not regime change. And that whatever we do ought to be predicated on what our national security interests are. And a weapons of mass destruction or a disarmament campaign, either diplomatic or military, would be far different from an invasion, conquest, occupation campaign to engage in regime change. For example, there were 700 sites that we had identified as possible sites of weapons of mass destruction development. Well, that's a target-rich environment. You could have just stood off and nailed those sites, much like the Clinton administration did during Desert Fox for several days to get their attention. You could have taken all sorts of different tacks. And in fact, when the president went to the Congress to get the use of force authorization, I did not like the language. Nobody in the foreign policy world really liked it, and certainly in the democratic world liked the language, but we didn't get a vote on the language. We got an up or down vote on the use of force authorization. The president sold the use of force authorization really not as a go-to-war authorization, but as give me the leverage I need to go to the United Nations to get an intrusive inspection regime put into place. That's not me who makes that analysis. It's Susan Collins, who I spent several days with in South Africa a couple of years ago, last year in fact, who told me in great detail the arguments that Colin Powell made to her in securing her support for the use of force authorization. I supported the president when he went to the UN and when he got Resolution 1441 passed unanimously. The betrayal of the world, the betrayal of the Congress of the United States, the betrayal of us as Americans was not in getting the use of force authorization and in going to the UN and getting 1441 passed. It was in not allowing the UN inspection system to work. That was the great tragedy of all of this. And where I broke, by the way, after my first article appeared, I sent copies of it to the first President Bush, to Jim Baker, and to Brent Scowcroft. I did so as a matter of courtesy because I cited in the article some of our shared experiences from the first Gulf War. The day my article arrived on Brent's desk, he called me up and said, "Can I take this over to the White House? They should read this. They should read this. They could benefit from the experience that you bring to the table." 2 or 3 days later, I got a letter from the first President Bush in which he said, "I agree with virtually everything in your article." And a couple days after that, I got a letter from Jim Baker saying essentially the same thing. So my position was not an anti-Bush position, so long as the Bush administration was really focused on what I consider to be our legitimate national security concerns, which were disarmament. And the Bush administration rhetoric changed in the weeks after my article appeared. Not because of the article, but because Tony Blair had thought his way through this issue in much the same way that we had. And you've heard the president come out after a meeting with Blair and say the objective, the policy of this government is to disarm Saddam. And somebody asked Colin Powell, well, how do you square disarming with the regime change rhetoric of last month? And Colin Powell said, well, if we disarm him, by definition, the regime will have changed. So where I broke with the administration was when they effectively broke with the rest of the world.
What was your reaction when the Butler Commission in Britain seemed to contradict some of this?
Well, whitewashes are whitewashes, whether they're the SSCI report or the Butler report. But let me also just get back to the last part of your question, which I did not answer. When I wrote my article, I did so because I had attempted from March, when it became clear, March of 2003, when it became clear that the president had been referring to Niger when he made the statement in the State of the Union address. I believed then, and I believe now, that a citizen has a civic duty to hold his government to account in a democracy for what his government says and does in the name of the American people. It's as simple as that. Now, this was not an act of great political courage or great moral courage. I didn't leak 7,000 pages of top-secret documents. My name's Joe Wilson. It is not Dan Ellsberg. Dan Ellsberg went through a real process, a moral crisis, to come to the decision that he made to betray national secrets because of his moral opposition to the way the war was being conducted in Vietnam. My article was 1,500 words long. It was entitled, "What I Did Not Find in Africa." It betrayed no secrets whatsoever because there were no secrets to betray. My ticket was purchased in my name. I went out there in my name to do my job. I was not, however, so naive as to believe that this administration would just simply roll over and not try and attack my credibility. After all, I have been in Washington for long enough to figure that they might come back at me. And indeed, I prepared myself for it. I had my pictures of the first President Bush and me strolling in the Rose Garden 18 hours before the launching of Desert Storm. I had handwritten notes from the first President Bush. I had my Defense Department Distinguished Service Award, which is a very senior Defense Department award, which I'd been nominated for by the NATO commander who had been Al Haig's military aide when Al Haig was Chief of Staff in the White House. So I had all this stuff. I was ready to go. I was ready for these guys to come at me. But I never believed that they would be so foolish as to compromise the identity of one of their own. Compromise the identity of somebody who every day came to work to ensure that weapons of mass destruction would not explode in an American city.
So, since that time, the Novak column appeared also in July of 2003. That's almost 2.5 years ago now. Do you believe, in retrospect, that this was an effort within the Office of the Vice President and perhaps other agencies to shift the blame on what happened in Iraq and the absence of weapons of mass destruction to the Central Intelligence Agency? Is there basically an internal struggle within the Bush administration of which you and your wife are pawns, or was that an incorrect judgment in your part?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from some of the stuff that's come out lately is the Office of the Vice President obsessed about me from even before my article was written. Now,
Why?
well, you'd have to ask them. I come from California, where
Is this a plus?
the sun comes up, the sun goes down, the surf is good. Why would I bother to believe in conspiracy theories or worry about conspiracy theories? The further east you go, however, the more you get into conspiracy theories. And it's pretty clear to me that the Vice President thought that I was acting on behalf of the CIA in launching this sort of war, rearguard action against him for decisions that he had taken. He and his senior staff had clearly not written or had not read the Christoph article very well and had not read my article very well. Had they bothered to read either the Christoph article, of which I was a source, or my article, they would have learned that I said very clearly that the Office of the Vice President asked the question of the CIA, which then resulted in my trip out there. It was not the Vice President asking the question, although in the end it was, he asked the question that led to my trip. But they also, I think that they were pretty paranoid. Now, after 2.5 years of dealing with these guys, I can tell you that, that just because you're a little bit paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. But I think that they, you know, I think they tried to, they were worried about that. I think ultimately they were trying to also to divert attention from the lies that underpinned the justification for war in the first place. And as I said earlier tonight, I'm pretty convinced that before this is all over, they will ultimately try and blame me for the war in Iraq. They've tried to blame me for everything else. There's two unassailable facts in this matter. One is the 16 words in the State of the Union address. Now, who knows? Who can name in this room the person who put those 16 words in the State of the Union address? Who can tell me why? Who can tell me who cleared it? I can tell you because I know this issue backwards and forwards. But you can't tell me those names. If you can, raise your hand.
Well, Steve Hadley claimed some
Well, let me
responsibility
finish.
for
You're
that.
right. But they claim responsibility for not having read his own files, not for... but everybody in the world knows the name of Joe Wilson and Valerie Wilson, or Valerie Plain Wilson. Novak didn't even get her last name right. So that tells you how successful these guys were in diverting attention from the 16 words to Wilson and his wife. The second unassailable fact is that somebody leaked the name of a covered CIA employee to the press. Now, at dinner tonight, somebody asked me the question of all these people who are running around Washington saying, well, Wilson was talking about his wife at cocktail parties. Wilson doesn't drink. Wilson has 5-year-old twins. Wilson doesn't go to very many cocktail parties. Wilson doesn't like cocktail parties. In fact, as ambassador, I learned how to go to National Day parties and spend a minimal amount of time there. I did it very well. You walk in one door, you walk out the back door. It's as simple as that. The fact is that somebody leaked the name. Pat Fitzgerald, in his indictment, made it very clear in the first sentence that the first time her name was leaked to somebody who should not have had that information was when Mr. Libby leaked her name to Judy Miller. And yet, there is still this attempt to try and make Valerie and me responsible for this, including Peter King, the distinguished Republican representative from Long Island, saying the other day that Valerie deserved what she got. I used a term to describe Mr. King in a speech I gave in Seattle last week. I won't use it again tonight because the Newsday reporters, the local newspaper reporters called me and asked me about it, so I will not use that term. But you can imagine what it is. But anyway, there are those two unassailable facts. Two unassailable facts. Joe Wilson, Valerie Wilson had nothing to do with either of them. Indeed, had my report and the other 2 reports been heeded, the 16 words would never have been in the State of the Union address. And had these guys shown proper respect for the national security of this country, Valerie's name would still be covered, would still be classified.
Well, one final question, then we'll open it up to the audience. And of course, it's a large issue, which is the role of the press in all of this, which has many different dimensions. In the new issue of The New Yorker that's just out, Nicholas Lehman, a writer for The New Yorker and also Dean of Columbia School of Journalism, writes, "Now that Fitzgerald's grand jury has issued an indictment of a major administration official, attention will shift quickly away from the press and toward the many troubles of the Bush White House. For the prosecutor, forcing reporters to testify about their sources was just a means to the end of indicting Libby. Yet it would be too comforting to conclude that this was a one-time disaster for the press, which will never be repeated." There's a whole melange of facts here, including whether possibly the Office of the Vice President was seeking to use the press in a way to further its own objectives. Can you just comment on that?
Well, sure. I called Tim Russer just the other day to offer him associate membership in a very select club. Actually, it's not that select, as there's a lot of us who have been smeared by the Bushies. But I was going to give him his own, thank you, his own T-shirt, which didn't say smeared by the Bushies, but said something else by the Bushies. Again, probably not suitable for family TV. But yeah, I mean, I think the press was set up. The press was set up by the administration. The press was fed lies by Mr. Libby. And you go back and you read what Libby told Miller, read it in her own account, about the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate, and what it said about uranium from Africa. It wasn't nearly as conclusive. In fact, it misstated the facts there. Go back and read what Miller acceded to, Scooter Libby saying to her he wanted to be referred to in any article as a former Hill staffer. Yeah, I too would like to be referred to as a former kindergarten graduate. But that is misleading, is it not? And then to pawn off on the press responsibility for the leak because you thought that the press might refuse to testify and therefore you'd be able to cover up the leak in the first place. What an abuse of the press. Now, I happen to be grateful that I'm not a journalist and not a First Amendment lawyer. But I will tell you this as a simple citizen, I don't think that the New York Times did the custom of acceding to the press's desire to protect their sources. I don't think that the way that the New York Times handled this case did that particular custom any favors whatsoever. And I think ultimately that the judge, the appellate court judge, Judge Tattle of the D.C. Appellate Court, who wrote a 43-page ruling in which he said, among other things, if Mr. Cooper were arguing that he wanted to protect a source who was exposing government wrongdoing, then that would be one issue that we should take under consideration. But in fact, what he's arguing is that we should protect a source who was engaged in wrongdoing, and that is simply not sustainable. And I think when all this is over, it seems to me that the press is going to have a heart-to-heart with itself about ground rules, about how it's going to deal with what apparently conflicts between its responsibilities as journalists and its responsibilities as citizens. And in this case, I think that they could have dealt with that without having to litigate this thing up to the Supreme Court and back. Other than that, tonight I have very few strong views.
Okay, well, as you see, we have a large number of questions from the audience, and I apologize in advance for only being able to
Generally,
get to a few of them.
when we do these with a microphone, they're generally the first three questions, particularly during the campaign last year. First one would come from somebody who was speaking the Republican talking points, sort of right out of Rush Limbaugh. Second one was from somebody from Lyndon LaRouche, giving their viewpoint. And a third one would always be somebody from the Kerry campaign asking me to spend the rest of the half hour of questions and answers extolling the virtues of John Kerry. So.
Okay, well, here's one that's not in any of those categories. I know you're not a technical man, but you're familiar with a number of these nuclear energy, nuclear weapons issues. So we'll start with this one. Given sufficient quantities of heavy water, would it have been possible for Saddam to transform uranium-238 into plutonium? Yellow cake is ore, and uranium oxide is unenriched. With about 5 tons of heavy water and 10 tons of uranium, a crude plutonium breeder reactor can be fashioned. Reactors such as this exist in Canada, India, and elsewhere, and can create 30 to 45 kilograms of plutonium per year. What do you think? That's a Berkeley question.
You know, I guess when you hang out near Livermore, you're going to know all this stuff. The question I was asked to look at was of course, mining. The issues that were put forward by the administration in support of the nuclear argument were 2. Actually, there were 3 points that the President made to substantiate or to support the assertion that we could not afford to wait for the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. The first assertion made by the President of the United States was that Saddam Hussein was only a softball size worth of fissile material away from having a nuclear weapon. Second assertion was, made in the State of the Union address, was that we had interdicted or captured aluminum tubes that could be used as centrifuges to enrich uranium. And the third one, of course, was that Saddam Hussein, or the British government learned that Saddam Hussein recently attempted to purchase significant quantities of uranium from Africa. I debated these issues on the administration, with the administration, on the facts that they presented to the public. They presented no other facts to the public on this. I do know that when I was in Niger in the 90s, Freeport-McMoRan was building a mining facility for uranium up in the northern part of the country. They have their own uranium in the northern part of the country. That facility was destroyed in the first Gulf War. What else they might have done is something that I don't know, and I don't know how much heavy water, light water you need to make the sort of rudimentary reactor. I will tell you this, however, and that is that UN Security Council Resolution 1441, which the U.S. and the U.K. were co-authors, they basically had the pen in drafting that resolution, argued, Article 10 of that urged all member states of the United Nations to share with the International Atomic Energy Agency all information it had on prohibited nuclear programs in Iraq so that the International Atomic Energy Agency could check them out. And to the best of my knowledge, the only information that the U.S. shared with them on this particular matter were the aluminum tubes and, of course, the documents which later were determined by Al-Baradei to be forgeries.
All right. I don't know that that fully answers the question, but it's certainly a major answer. We'll shift to something rather different.
And again, the issue that I'm not a WMD specialist. I've never made any claims to be a WMD specialist. I'm a specialist in Africa. I know a lot about the uranium mining business. I know a lot about how African governments work, and I had terrific contacts in Niger, amongst those whose signatures would have appeared on any memorandum of sale document.
Here's on a slightly lighter vein. What do your ex-surfer buddies think about your being at the center of this monster political wave?
Pretty cool, dude. Obviously we've gotten a lot of support from our friends. And I say in most of my speeches around the country that the lesson from all of this, really, it seems to me, is vigilance in the protection of our democracy. As Benjamin Franklin said, thank you. Benjamin Franklin, when he left the Constitutional Convention Hall, I guess 1787, after the last session, drafting session.
I remember that.
He was, I don't, but it was, I think you told me, in fact. An eyewitness. He was accosted on the street by some lady who said, "Mr. Franklin, what sort of country have you bequeathed us?" And his response was, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it," by which, of course, he meant you have to hold your government to account. You have to be vigilant. You have to have these checks and balances. This country was based on checks and balances so that there would be limits on how much power accrued to any particular branch. And that's what democracy is all about. So that's what this story is all about from my perspective.
In your book and in other sources, you are very complimentary about the first President Bush, who said some very nice things about you.
Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Question, do you know how George Bush Sr., it's actually George Herbert Walker Bush, how George Bush Sr. feels about the way your wife was treated by this administration?
I do, because he wrote me a long handwritten note about how distressed he felt about it. A personal note, I've never divulged the contents to anybody, but it was very meaningful and very heartfelt. He's also said publicly, he said at the dedication of the C.I.A. headquarters as the George Bush C.I.A. headquarters, which would have been in 99, I think, was it? He said in his speech that those who would betray the sources of our intelligence are the most insidious of traitors. That's pretty clear to me. I mean, it's good enough for George Bush, it's good enough for me. I'm not his rebellious son.
Senator Harry Reid has recently called for a pledge of no pardons in the leak scandal. What is your perspective on the possibility of pardons, presidential pardons?
Well, I think I certainly appreciate the support of those who want to see justice done, because I think all of us should want to see justice done. It's important to remember that any crimes that were committed were not committed against Joe Wilson. They were committed against you. They were committed against all Americans. They were committed against the national security of this country. And as such, we should all be looking at this as and what Harry Reid says or what anybody else has to say from the perspective that we're all, in a sense, victims of any crimes that were committed. Now, the presidential pardon power is a constitutionally granted power. So while I think it's useful to get on the record that you don't want the president to pardon him, it's probably unrealistic. I just want to go back to what I said earlier, and that is that it's important in all of this to see what Mr. Fitzgerald has done as a reaffirmation that this is a country, a social contract that is predicated on the concept of the rule of law, and that is sacrosanct, and no man is above the law.
There are quite a few similar questions seeking your thoughts on how Iraq will turn out, what we should do, what kind of new strategies or tactics you would suggest. Could you share some of those thoughts?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's important to understand that Iraq is a mess. There's just no getting around it. I think that a friend of mine who was in Iraq at the very beginning and was in a neighboring country and watching it very closely and working on Iraq operations for a couple of years, recently said that we could not have planned an insurgency, a long-term violent insurgency, any better if we had tried than what we've got in Iraq. I think the U.S. military is beginning to realize it. What I fear is that when you have a military adventure that goes bad, what you really hemorrhage is political capital to do anything, to exercise leadership on the global stage. And far more than our military power or economic might, it has always been our leadership capability that has allowed us to act in our interests and in the broader collective interest. We were talking earlier about having to drag the Europeans into sort of the Dayton process over Yugoslavia because you just don't get leadership from the Europeans. You don't get leadership from anybody. You get the Americans who, at their best, will knock heads and get people to act in something other than their narrowest self-interest. But when that political capital hemorrhages, when you have a setback, there is no political will left to exercise that particular leadership. And what I fear most of all is that in our haste to extract ourselves from Iraq, we will forsake some of our legitimate interests in the region. And so what I would argue is we need to take 3 steps pretty much immediately. One is to stop the erosion of political support for anything in the Middle East. We need to quit putting Americans in harm's way unnecessarily. It is absolutely silly to have Americans patrolling the streets of Baghdad or any other town in Iraq. It's absolutely crazy to have them put in positions where they're vulnerable to IEDs, suicide bombers, or anything else. We should limit their engagement and the troop size on the ground to providing capabilities that we can provide and that nobody else can provide. The Iraqis can't provide. The Iraqis can provide troops. We can provide training, logistical support, possibly intel platforms, and possibly an extremis air support, and we should limit our engagement to that. Even before we start talking about a withdrawal or strategy or timetable strategy, get our guys off the streets. As a corollary to that, we should stop killing Arabs unnecessarily. The idea of Americans leading these clearly sort of vengeful attacks into Ramadi and Tel Afar and Fallujah and other places around the country, and kicking in doors and kicking in gates and killing Arabs is repugnant to the Arab world, where we still really want to have friends and people who don't hate us. And all we're doing is we're generating this sort of massive hatred of us. And if you don't believe it, you should really read, to understand how Arabs think about this, you should read their version of the truth as they get it from Al Jazeera. Don't read the truth as told you by those who have done shock and awe, but read the truth as told you by those who have been on the receiving end of shock and awe. Get a sense of what these people feel. Now, those are the two things I would do almost immediately. The other thing, by the way, when you're talking about killing Arabs, we are essentially killing Sunni Arabs on behalf of a Shia-dominated government and their Iranian patrons. American troops are involved in somebody else's civil war on behalf of our arch enemy, Iran, and the mullahs of Iran. Now, how does that grab you? The winner in this war has been Iran. They have expanded their influence exponentially to the northern border of Israel and to the northern border of Kuwait. And from there, they will be able to expand and much better position to realize their hegemonic ambition. We should not be party to that. It doesn't help us with the Sunni. We're going to make them hate us. And when I talk, by the way, when I talk about Sunni and Shia and Kurds, understand that Iraq is a little bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of clan and tribal allegiances that are as important as confessional allegiances, but it's just shorthand for what we're really talking about here. By killing Sunni on behalf of the Shia, we're not going to get the Iranians or the Iraqi Shia to like us any better. And just wait, it will not be long before Mr. Sistani comes out and says it's time for the Americans to come home. And the third thing that I would do in the aftermath of this Constitution vote, and by the way, the Constitution is a little more than a peace agreement between the Shia and the Kurds at the expense of the Sunni. But I would argue that it was provided an opening, and this administration is utterly incapable of taking the opening, to try and resuscitate an international consortium to help try and find a political solution. That consortium, in my judgment, would include Europeans who have much at stake in chronic instability in the Middle East. It would include Iraq's neighbors, including Iran. I wrote this in the Seattle Times just a couple days before Condi Rice actually testified that we might have direct contact with Iran. And it includes anybody else who has a legitimate interest in the region. The Sunni needs some advocates. The Sunni needs some confidence that they are not forever forsaken if they're ever going to be encouraged to make the difficult decisions of abandoning the insurgency. And right now, there's nobody helping them through this process. On the other hand, there's nobody on the other side who can help restrain the Shia and the Kurds as they try and carve out additional pieces of territory for their own accounts. The United States cannot do that alone because we don't have any credibility doing it. Now, all this is to say, this is sort of a long way of dealing with this, but all this is to say that we actually do have, I believe, legitimate interests in the region that we want to promote and defend, not just on our own behalf, but on behalf of really the sort of the way of life that we've enjoyed during a period which I would hope be the beginning of a transition from a petroleum-based society. But until we get there, we still have, to put it crassly, we still have the need to be able to defend the sort of strategic oil pools that are there. And we need to be able to do it from a beachhead that is much more friendly to us than Iraq is. And in the run-up to the war, we were able actually to establish status of forces agreements, basing rights agreements, and indeed forward bases in these little emirates all up and down the Persian Gulf littoral. And we were accepted there because, of course, we would be a tripwire force in these little countries that were hemmed in on the one side by Iran and its ambitions, and on the other side by Saudi Arabia. If populations become restive because of what we're doing in Iraq, it becomes more difficult to find a friendly beachhead where we can position ourselves to really be responsive to what are not just our national security interests, but the international community's interests.
We have time for just a couple of other questions. You've discussed this at some length tonight, and you've written about it, and you've discussed this on television as well. But let's hear one more time. At the core, what do you believe was the motivation behind revealing your wife's identity?
Well, I think my speculation on this has always been that it was done essentially to silence other potential critics. There were those, at that time, there was a lot of chatter in Washington, there were a lot of leaks to the press about analysts who felt that they'd been pressured into having their conclusions conform to the political decisions that had already been taken. There was a lot of talk about how much time Cheney spent out at the agency, how much time Libby spent out at the agency. There was one DIA analyst who should be able to retire, I think, in 2 years, who was telling people that he had been put in untenable positions by political types who would ask him the same question 30 times until they would get the answer they wanted, things like that. And so I think my speculation was always that this was a shot across the bow to those people who were beginning to talk. And the message to them was, if you do to us what Wilson did to you, we'll do to you what we just did to Wilson's family. Now, there was a senior administration official who leaked to the Washington Post that this was pure revenge, that these guys just wanted political payback, as Karl Rove was apparently running around the White House saying, Wilson's a Democrat, that's why we have to do this to him, as if Democrats are subhuman. Scooter Libby was running around the White House saying Wilson's an asshole. There are a few things I could say about Scooter Libby at this point, after what he has done, using his position to abuse the public trust. I think now, having looked at the indictment and looked at the way that the Vice President and his office has operated, I think on the one hand, they were probably pretty paranoid that this was a CIA, that I was fronting for the CIA in attacking, which was not true. I did not clear my article. Nobody at the CIA knew my article was being written, except for Valerie, who did not know it in her capacity as a CIA officer. She knew it in her capacity as my wife, and did not share that with anybody. So I think they were a little bit paranoid, and I think maybe probably that was about it.
So just let me just quickly personally follow up on this latter part of what you just said. It's possible that in this intense rivalry between portions of the administration, including the Office of the Vice President and the Department of Defense, and the CIA, the fact that you, having gone there at the behest of the CIA, having been married to a CIA covert operative, they could have misinterpreted this as part of a CIA effort to discredit the policy, and they're retaliating. Is that in part what you're saying?
Yeah, that's possibly it. Of course, they misinterpreted everything else. They misinterpreted the intelligence. They misinterpreted the threat. I think when the history of this time is written, Mr. Cheney will not come out of it looking very good.
Maybe we can get him here to offer his own thoughts about it. One final personal question, and there are several other personal questions in this in the list from the audience. Do you have any aspirations to run for political office?
I used to have what I thought was a pretty clever answer to that, but then but there's always somebody in the audience who reports directly back to Brit Hume, and Brit Hume takes a clever answer and assumes that I'm saying something other than a joke. So, so Brit, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you more fodder for your fake news program tonight. I served my country for 23 years, and I was proud to do so. It was a noble calling. It was a great honor to be able to promote those values that I think make our country the greatest experiment in self-governance the world has ever seen. Those values are enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution of the United States and its amendments, and in the UN Human Rights Charter, which never would have bound the rest of the world to these certain fundamental principles had it not been for American leadership. It was a great career. The United States government, successive administrations have not been without their flaws, but by and large, the driving factor of our foreign policy when I was there were those values that I just articulated. I've been out of government now for several years. I look forward really to having an opportunity to go back and be a private citizen and to raise my two 5-year-old twins. I believe that that service to country is something that everybody should welcome and should aspire to. That's one point or another. I have done it, and I currently do not aspire to it, even if Arnold Schwarzenegger is in the doldrums. Make no mistake about it. I mean, as a practical matter, I live in Washington, D.C., where we don't have representation. And my real home, my heart, and my ties are really to the state of California, which is ably represented, perhaps not in the governor's house, but it's certainly in the U.S. Senate, and I expect it to be ably represented by your two representatives for the foreseeable future. And even if I were to come back to California and run for elected office in Washington, or even if I were to come back to California, whatever you may think of politicians, and I have my views about Senator Roberts, Hatch, Bond, and some of the others, but they work pretty hard. And you essentially spend half your time in your constituency and half your time in Washington, which would mean that at best you would just be a part-time father. And I would just as soon not be a part-time father, because I've found the joys of being a father to my 5-year-old twins are such that I wouldn't want to give that up. But thank you for the suggestion. Let me, if I can, thank you. If I can just make one sort of closing remark to those of you who've come out tonight. I appreciate your coming out. And I think if there is in fact a lesson from the experience that Valerie and I have gone through, it is that it is worth, our democracy is worth the fight. We should not allow citizens to be driven out of the public square by this abuse of power on the part of elected officials and their allies. The campaigns of character assassination, not just against me, but against others who were involved in the debate, is really unconscionable. And it is not worthy of a great democracy. And my own view of the fight that I've waged, and I've said this earlier, is that frankly I don't know of any other way to confront school bullies other than stand up to them. And I would hope that if you take away any sort of inspiration from what we have done as citizens, it is that it is the right and responsibility of us as citizens to hold our government to account at every level. And I know in Berkeley, in particular, you do that. And you don't have to do it on weapons of mass destruction in Washington, but I'm sure you do it every day with your city planning commission, with your local representative, with my friend Barbara Lee, who must get, I'm sure she gets an inbox full of them. and that's what I really hope when I talk out on campuses and to university students who are just embarking on a life where they're able to vote and participate fully in the civic affairs of this great country. It is worth participating. You ought to watch what your politicians are doing with the same enthusiasm that you watch Cal Berkeley's football team. Because if you don't, you will find this democracy slips from our hands. And that is what we're seeing today. We're seeing it slip from our hands by an administration that is not a Republican administration. It is a radical administration that has kind of stolen the banner of the Republican Party, but is imposing upon this country policies that have nothing to do with republicanism. Other than that, thank you.
Well, I think it's unquestionable we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the causes of war. We've talked about possible misuse of intelligence. We've talked about the infringement of civil liberties, malfeasance in the White House, civic duty, and we're really in your debt for bringing all these issues to our attention. And thank you very much, Ambassador Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you all.